August 21st, 1942, Guadalcanal. The jungle was still, the night thick with humidity. Somewhere beyond the coconut palms, the ocean murmured, a slow pulse against the sandbars of Alligator Creek. The Marines of the 1st Division waited in the dark, sweat trickling beneath steel helmets, the faint metallic tang of gun oil clinging to the air. Their machine guns, relics of another war, sat ready on tripods, Browning M1917s with long water jackets, hoses coiled to condensation cans that hissed faintly in the heat. At Urwo 2:30, the silence broke. A whistle, sharp and shrill. Then came the shouting, thousands of voices in one wordless scream. The Japanese Ichiki detachment charged out of the tree line, bayonets catching moonlight, banners rising like ghosts. The Marines opened fire. Belts fed, barrels steamed, and the flat ground erupted into a continuous roar. Tracer fire drew white arcs across the black, cutting through bodies and banners alike. Within minutes, the charge dissolved into silence again, broken only by the slow hiss of cooling water jackets and the distant surf. They had used old guns, built before most of them were born, but on that night, those relics ended the newest form of death in moments. When American forces went to war in 1941, the Marine Corps was still a small expeditionary arm of fewer than 70,000 men. It had spent decades guarding embassies, manning gunboats, and conducting brief interventions across the tropics. Industrial mobilization was still ramping up, and procurement priorities favored the Army and the Navy's shipyards long before they reached the Marines. So when the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War, they did so carrying the ghosts of a previous generation's arsenal. Body drone, Tanin Van, Sada Browning, M19-17, 30 caliber water-cooled machine gun, had first barked at Belleau Wood 25 years earlier. The bolt-action Springfield M1903, with its long barrel and tight chamber, belonged to an era of trench raids and wire cutters. The M1918 Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, had been designed for walking fire across shell-churned mud. Even the pump-action trench, shotguns, the Winchester 1897s and 1912s, were direct descendants of the weapons doughboys used in 1918 to German dugouts, CT, 1942. These designs looked ancient beside the new M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles arriving in limited numbers for the U.S. Army. Yet the Marines had little choice. Production bottlenecks, inter-service priorities, and the Corps' smaller size meant they received the leftovers. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance allocated new automatic weapons primarily to the Army's expanding divisions bound for Europe. The Marines, preparing to fight an island war, armed themselves from what was available, sometimes from what had been sitting in depots since the Great War. At Camp Elliott and New River, recruits trained with Springfields and bars, learning to make every shot count. Marine manuals still referenced beaten zones and grazing fire, terms born in IOS 1917. It turned out that this older vocabulary was about to prove prophetic. The Pacific was no battlefield of sweeping maneuver or armored columns. It was a series of cramped, brutal perimeters, lines drawn around airstrips and hilltops that had to be held through the night. Jungle humidity warped rifles. Coral dust jammed bolts. Replacement parts arrived weeks late on overburdened transports. When something worked, Marines kept it running, no matter its age. The M1917 Browning, heavy and awkward, was almost immune to heat-induced stoppages. Its water-cooling sleeve allowed it to fire belt after belt without seizing. In static defense, where the fight might come at 2 in the morning, with no time to swap barrels, it was perfect. The old trench shotgun also found its place. In the jungles of Tulagi and on the ridges near the Matanikau, point men learned to favor the short-barreled Winchester. At 15 yards, it was devastating, a weapon of instant authority. The bar, carried by two-man teams, gave every squad its own base of fire, a concept that predated the word fire team, but anticipated its logic. By the time the first Japanese troops landed east of the Lunga perimeter, the Marines' position was still half-finished. Their heavy machine gun crews had dug shallow pits along the sandy banks of the Ilu River, mistakenly called Alligator Creek. They strung telephone wire between emplacements and registered ranges by moonlight. There were no reserves to fall back on, no replacements waiting offshore. Each gun team, each squad, represented a single point of resistance. Their adversaries came with a doctrine forged from a different century's myth. The Japanese Imperial Army believed in the power of will, the shock of the charge, the moral dominance of the bayonet. It had worked against poorly armed colonial forces in China and Malaya. The Ichiki detachment that faced the Marines on August 21st believed that an American perimeter, however fortified, could be overrun through sheer audacity. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, men crouched behind sand berms, feeding canvas belts into tripods designed before they were born. On the other, soldiers carrying Aresaka rifles with fixed bayonets, convinced the spirit of the attack could breach any defense. The outcome would not just decide a single night, it would redefine the role of obsolete weapons in modern war. The Marines didn't know it yet, but those ancient Brownings and Springfields would write the opening chapter of the Pacific Ground War's true nature: endurance over impulse, discipline over spectacle, sustained fire over heroic charge. The pattern forged that night would echo through every island that followed, from Baitio's seawall to Paleliu's ridges, each battle proving that reliability, not novelty, kept men alive. The Japanese army entered the Pacific War carrying a doctrine steeped in imperial tradition and early 20th century romanticism. At its core lay Seishin, the belief that spiritual force could overcome material inferiority. "One man with the spirit of Yamato," an officer manual declared, "is worth 10 without." In practice, this meant offensive warfare at any cost, culminating in the Banzai charge, a coordinated rush intended to overwhelm defenders through speed, noise, and absolute disregard for survival. Early campaigns had reinforced that confidence. In Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines, Japanese infantry had shattered unprepared British and American positions. Night assaults, flanking infiltrations, and human wave charges often met panicked retreat rather than disciplined fire. When Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led his elite detachment ashore at Guadalcanal, he expected another repeat. His 900 men, veterans of the China front, believed the handful of Marines holding Henderson Field would collapse under shock. They did not yet understand that the ground and the weapons waiting for them were different. Kuritrit and Twin built their defense in overlapping arcs, each Browning M1917 commanding a lane of fire plotted to intersect with its neighbor. Flares hung on tripwires. Mortars were pre-registered to fire at set distances. In front of the sand berms lay a narrow channel of tidal mud, knee-deep, illuminated by moonlight, and perfectly open. Every weapon, every coordinate, had been calculated. At 02:30 on August 21st, Ichiki's men charged across it. They were met not by sporadic rifle shots, but by a coordinated wall of flame. The old Brownings clattered at a constant 450 rounds per minute, their barrels steaming in the night air. The 37mm M3 guns fired canister, hundreds of steel balls shredding the front ranks. Mortar shells burst behind them, cutting off retreat. Within minutes, the attack disintegrated into bodies piled in the water. By dawn, the Ichiki detachment had ceased to exist. The battle at Alligator Creek, later called the Tenaru, was not just a tactical victory, it was a lesson. The Banzai charge had met its natural countermeasure, sustained, planned automatic fire from interlocking positions. The same tools that defined Western Front warfare in 1918 had re-emerged, refined by 20 years of doctrine, and now served as the template for Pacific defense. Across 1943 and 1944, the pattern repeated. At Tarawa's Betio Island, Japanese defenders launched desperate night counterattacks against the Marine beachhead. The perimeter held only because water-cooled Brownings and bars maintained unbroken arcs of fire. At Cape Gloucester and Peleliu, Banzai thrusts ended the same way, reduced to chaos under disciplined fire control. In each battle, the environment seemed designed for those old guns. The Pacific nights were long. Humidity was constant. Air-cooled machine guns like the M19-119A4 risked overheating, while the M19-1 Sudden's water jacket guaranteed continuity. Even after hours of firing, a quick top-off from a canteen or a nearby stream kept the weapon alive. For the Marines, the lesson was both practical and cultural. The Corps had long inherited the traditions of Belleau Wood, where machine guns stopped German assaults at 50 yards. That institutional memory lived in the manuals and in the senior NCOs who had trained under pre-war veterans. What looked like outdated equipment was, in reality, a continuation of a philosophy. That defensive discipline and sustained automatic fire, not romantic aggression, decided wars of attrition. The Japanese learned their own hard truths. By late 1943, commanders began abandoning massed charges in favor of infiltration, sniping, and cave defense. But on Saipan and Okinawa, when desperation forced another final rush, the result was identical. Thousands killed in minutes by weapons first designed before the armistice of 1918. The oldest guns were never meant to last this long. Yet they did, because they fit the nature of the Pacific War perfectly. Static lines, night assaults, endless heat, and the need for reliability over innovation. From these battlefields emerged a paradox. Modern warfare, waged with aircraft carriers and code breaking, still depended on century-old steel and water jackets to decide who lived through the night. The lesson had only begun to unfold. What followed were the angles, the human, tactical, and technological reasons those relics shaped the rhythm of victory. Combat on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and later Peleliu was not a cinematic charge and response, but a waiting game measured in breaths. Behind the sandbags, the men who manned the old guns faced hours of silence before seconds of hell. Each machine gun crew worked as one organism. Gunner, loader, ammo carrier, all bound by repetition. They knew that when the whistle or shout came, they had seconds to act or die. Every Marine understood that firing too early risked revealing the line. Firing too late meant being overrun. The discipline to wait was learned in training yards with wooden mock-ups, carried forward into the heat of the jungle. The Browning M1917 demanded patience. Its water jacket needed topping, its feed belt steady hands. Each belt contained 250 rounds, 20 seconds of life or death. When the first flares went up at Tenaru, men who had never been under fire locked into that rhythm automatically. The weapon didn't chatter like a submachine gun. It roared, measured, deep, unbroken. That sound became a psychological wall. Across the creek, Japanese infantry heard it and charged harder, believing speed might close the distance. It never did. In those moments, the gun wasn't just metal. It was order itself, a point of stability in chaos. Every Marine who survived a night assault carried the memory not of faces or orders, but of the steady pulse of that weapon doing exactly what it was designed to do. The men didn't love the Browning for nostalgia. They trusted it because, under pressure, it never failed. The Pacific Island perimeter defense was an engineer's war as much as a soldier's. Every Browning, Bar and 37 millimeter gun was placed not by guesswork, but by geometry. The doctrine of interlocking fields of fire, an inheritance from the Western Front, became gospel again. Machine guns were sighted to create overlapping beaten zones that extended just above ground level. When one gun engaged, the next picked up the overlap, forming a curtain of bullets the enemy couldn't bypass. Every rifleman's arc complemented those lanes. Mortars, pre-zeroed during daylight, filled the gaps. When Japanese troops launched a Banzai assault, the effect was devastatingly predictable. As they advanced shoulder to shoulder, each 50-yard segment of the approach was already marked. Once within the final protective line, usually 100 yards from the Marine foxholes, every gun fired simultaneously. The result wasn't chaotic, but choreographed annihilation. Reports from Guadalcanal describe hundreds of bodies found in semicircles, the shape of converging arcs. Commanders learned to trust range cards and mathematics over impulse. Where a new recruit saw a strip of sand, a veteran saw numbered grids of certain death. That fusion of WWI discipline and Pacific necessity meant the Marine perimeter became one of the deadliest defensive systems ever improvised. It wasn't the number of guns, but the synchronization that killed. Even when replacements arrived, lighter M19 194s, improved mortars, the underlying concept never changed. Geometry beats momentum. The old guns didn't just stop Banzai charges, they proved that technology is meaningless without tactical design. The M1917 Browning weighed nearly 100 pounds when assembled with tripod, water, and ammo. By all modern standards, it was a logistical nightmare. Yet in the Pacific, it became indispensable. Air-cooled guns like the M19-114 were lighter, but prone to overheating after long bursts, especially in the stifling jungle air where barrels never cooled. The water-cooled M19-17 could fire belt after belt with only a thin hiss from its jacket. Crews carried spare hoses and condensation cans, refilling them with canteen water when necessary. Some even urinated into the jacket to keep the weapon alive. An unsanctioned but frequent act of improvisation. Its slow rate of fire, roughly 450 rounds per minute, was perfect for defensive work. Controllable, accurate, and devastating when sustained. The recoil-operated mechanism was almost immune to jamming from mud or sand. The bar, another obsolete relic, filled the mid-range gap. Each squad's automatic rifleman delivered bursts that pinned flanking infiltrators. The combination of steady, heavy machine guns, mobile bars, and precision Springfields created a layered defense no Banzai could breach. What the Japanese expected to face, panicked bursts, sporadic resistance, was instead a mechanical storm engineered by veterans of a forgotten doctrine. In modern hindsight, these weapons looked ancient. In the Pacific, they were timeless. When reliability means survival, obsolescence is just a word. Technology, tactics, and human steadiness formed a trinity that transformed every night assault into a test of endurance rather than courage. Yet these were only half the story. Other dimensions explained why those old guns became legends across the islands. Among the most brutal yet effective tools of the Marine perimeter was the 37mm M3 gun-firing canister ammunition, a concept born in the trenches of World War I and resurrected in the jungles of the Pacific. Each round was a metal shell packed with roughly 120 steel balls that spread in a deadly cone over 60 yards. Fired at knee height, it transformed a light anti-tank gun into a massive shotgun. At Guadalcanal's Alligator Creek, two 37mm crews from the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines held the shallow ford where the Ichiki detachment attempted to cross. They had pre-sighted the distance to the opposite bank, 150 yards. When the first wave appeared under moonlight, the gunners waited for the signal flare. The first canister round exploded outward, tearing through the front ranks. Within seconds, the air filled with the sound of marbles hitting metal. Then, silence. After the fight, officers counted over 600 enemy bodies in the killing zone. The 37mm was no longer just an anti-armor weapon. It had become a defensive cornerstone. Throughout Tarawa, Peleliu, and even Okinawa, Marine gunners repeated the same principle. Short range, measured timing, mechanical precision. The canister round's return marked a full circle. The same physics that ended charges at the Somme now defended airstrips in the Solomons. Modern war had rediscovered its oldest equation: velocity plus discipline equals survival. Amid the roar of machine guns and mortars, victory still hinged on human leadership. The sergeants and lieutenants who enforced calm in chaos. In Marine history, their names rarely appear beside the battles they saved. Yet it was these men who translated doctrine into reflex. Every Browning crew relied on a section leader who understood range, sector overlap, and ammunition pacing. The order "hold your fire" was as sacred as "open fire." On Guadalcanal, Sergeant John Basilone embodied this precision. At Henderson Field, when Japanese troops stormed his sector during the October offensive, Basilone managed 3 M19 117s simultaneously. He cleared jams, swapped barrels, and carried belts under fire. His guns held for 2 days, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, preserved the perimeter's integrity. Such leadership wasn't heroic in the romantic sense. It was procedural heroism, the kind that saved lines by enforcing procedure when fear made thinking impossible. NCOs drilled fire discipline into their men until it replaced emotion. Across the islands, that culture turned the Marine defense into a machine of its own. When Banzai charges struck, command didn't come from distant headquarters, but from the muddy pit beside the gun. The calm voice counting bursts, the steady hand adjusting elevation, the insistence that nothing, not exhaustion, not fear, would break the line. For the Japanese Army, the annihilations at Tenaru, Tarawa, and Cape Gloucester forced a painful reckoning. Reports filtered back to Tokyo describing unprecedented machine gun fire that destroyed entire battalions in minutes. Officers realized that spiritual courage could not bridge the gap against coordinated automatic fire. By mid-1943, the Imperial Command began shifting tactics. The night Banzai charge was replaced by infiltration teams, small units crawling through jungle ravines to grenade foxholes or snipe radio operators. Engineers turned island interiors into fortress networks of caves, mutually supporting tunnels and interlocking bunkers. The fight evolved from motion to entrenchment. Yet even as doctrine changed, the old habits lingered. At Saipan in July 1944, nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers launched one last massive charge against U.S. lines. For nearly 15 minutes, the hillside blazed like daylight as hundreds of Browning and 37mm Tatter's guns fired point blank. When the shooting stopped, 90% of the attackers were dead. The Pacific War's later stages, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, showed how completely the charge had died. There were still attacks, but never again the unbroken wave of steel and shouting. The lesson had been written too clearly across too many beaches. In the end, it wasn't the invention of a new weapon that changed the war, but the rediscovery of old ones, a testimony to the fact that the tools of 1918 could still define 1945 when wielded with precision and will. With every angle revealed, from human endurance to tactical mathematics, the stage was set for the great demonstrations of these truths, the moments when Banzai charges met the unyielding rhythm of Browning fire. The first great test of the old guns came before dawn on August 21, 1942, at the Tenaru River. The Marines called it Alligator Creek. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment. Veterans of the Shanghai campaign landed east of Henderson Field, believing they faced only scattered resistance. They were confident, almost contemptuous. The Imperial Navy's bombardments had been heavy. The Americans, they thought, would retreat as others had. The Marines of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, waited quietly along the sandbank. Their defenses were textbook: rifle pits, bars interlaced with Browning M19-117 machine guns, and 37 mm M3s positioned to fire canister down the shallow causeway. The night air smelled of cordite oil and salt. In the darkness, they could hear faint chanting, the pre-attack ritual of Japanese troops invoking ancestral spirits. At Oro 2:30, flares arced up. The enemy advanced in waves across the open mudflat. For 10 seconds, the world was soundless. Then the first Browning opened. The effect was instantaneous, a wall of fire that did not falter or flicker. The M19-117s poured continuous streams of tracers, the hoses from their water jackets thrumming as steam hissed from condensation cans. Ichiki's men charged straight into a pre-sighted kill zone. The 37mm guns fired canister shells, their blasts flattening the lead ranks. Bar teams on the flanks raked anything that moved along the edges of the creek. Marines rotated ammunition belts and poured water over glowing jackets. Within 15 minutes, the front of the Japanese formation had been erased. Yet still, more came. Groups waded across the shallows, bayonets fixed, shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" until the words were drowned by machine gun rhythm. Every attempt to flank the perimeter found another interlocked lane of fire waiting. The assault broke apart, bodies piling in arcs that mirrored the range cards drawn days earlier. By dawn, more than 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Fewer than a dozen Marines had been killed. The difference was not luck. It was planning. The resurrection of WWI defensive science applied with ruthless precision. The Marines' weapons, outdated by modern standards, had done exactly what they were built for: to stop massed infantry by mathematics alone. When Marine patrols crossed the creek later that morning, they found the remnants of Ichiki's command post. The colonel had committed seppuku beside a burned Japanese flag. His sword, blood-stained and pitted, was recovered by a Marine corporal who later recalled, "He died for an idea that couldn't survive a Browning." News of Tenaru spread across the Pacific. To many Americans, it proved that the myth of the invincible Japanese charge had met its end. But for the Marines, it was only a beginning. The victory revealed both the power and the limits of their aging arsenal. Ammunition consumption had been staggering. Water jackets boiled dry. The Springfield's slow rate of fire was a liability in mobile pursuit. Commanders noted that while the old weapons had saved the line, future battles would require balance, mobility as well as defense. Still, the lesson stuck. In the months that followed, every Marine perimeter, from Bougainville to Cape Gloucester, was designed around the Tenaru template: overlapping MGs, pre-registered mortars, and canister-loaded 37 mm Fin military guns guarding every probable crossing. By late 1943, that system faced its fiercest test at Tarawa, an island barely 3 square miles wide, surrounded by coral reefs and defended by 4,800 Japanese troops determined to die in place. When the Marines landed on November 20th, they waded 600 yards through chest-deep water under fire. Many were cut down before reaching the sand, but those who made it formed hasty perimeters with the same weapons that had held at Guadalcanal. That night, Japanese counterattacks struck from multiple directions, emerging from trenches and seawalls. The defenders came in waves, a desperate echo of Ichiki's fatal charge. On Betio's dark shoreline, the Browning M1917s once again came alive. Positioned between wrecked landing craft, crews fired blind into the dark, guided only by sound. Marines poured seawater into the jackets when supplies ran dry. Canister from 37 VB. Tiropritzer guns swept the beach. In after-action reports, officers described the ground as unrecognizable, a carpet of bodies. A single Browning team under Corporal Harold Keller fired 13,000 rounds before dawn. Not a single gun jammed. The next morning, when sunlight revealed the scene, there were no organized Japanese formations left. Only scattered snipers and suicides remained. The old guns had done it again. At Tarawa, however, victory carried a new cost. 1,009 Marines dead, 2,100 wounded. The price of holding ground with such ferocity was staggering. Command realized that while their weapons were flawless in defense, the Pacific demanded offense next. Landing after landing, ridge after ridge. The Banzai charge had been defeated, but the war was far from over. The lessons of Tenaru and Tarawa now traveled with the Marines into every campaign that followed. Every machine gun section carried extra water hoses. Every platoon leader memorized his range card. Every private learned that calm fire, not courage, decided survival. But the Pacific was changing. New islands, new tactics, and more desperate enemies were coming. And soon, the old guns would face one last test against a fading empire's final bursts of fury. By late 1943, the Pacific War had become a rhythm of repetition. Landings, counterattacks, silence, and then rebuilding. The pattern the Marines had discovered on Guadalcanal was now doctrine, drilled into every platoon before they even left the transports. But the coming campaigns would prove something more profound. That even as America's industry flooded the Pacific with new weapons, it was the old ones that often decided the line between holding and annihilation. At Cape Gloucester, New Britain, December 1943, the 1st Marine Division again faced the full weight of Japanese counterattacks. The terrain was hell. Thick mangrove swamps, rain that never stopped, and mud that swallowed boots to the ankle. Modern weapons malfunctioned almost instantly. The M1 Garand rusted, and air-cooled guns overheated in the damp. The old M1917 Browning, heavy and slow, ignored the elements. Marines built firing platforms from coconut logs, lashed tripods into place, and filled water jackets from puddles. On the night of December 26th, when the Japanese 53rd Infantry Regiment launched a full Banzai assault toward Hill 660, the result mirrored Tenaru. The water-cooled Brownings opened at a fixed range, short, tight bursts that never stopped. Riflemen with Springfields and bars filled the gaps. The attack broke apart before it reached the wire. By morning, the mud around the Marine perimeter steamed from hundreds of empty jackets cooling in the rain. Each victory carried the same paradox. The Marines were now advancing island by island with carrier support, flamethrowers and new air-cooled machine guns, yet the backbone of their defense remained a design introduced when woodstock rifles and gas lanterns ruled the trenches. In 1944, as the U.S. prepared for Saipan and Peleliu, the Imperial Japanese Army still clung to its faith in spiritual warfare. Reinforced garrisons built elaborate defenses, but still trained to finish battles with massed charges. What awaited them on those islands would end that tradition forever. On Saipan, July 7, 1944, came the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. Before dawn, General Saito ordered every remaining man, nearly 3,000 troops, including clerks and wounded, to attack. The assault came in 3 columns, surging across the northern plain toward the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division and flanking Marine positions. At first light, a low roar rose from the ridges. Drums, bugles, and the guttural cries of men running toward machine gun fire. In the Marine sectors, the response was instinctive. The M1917s and 37V Mine 10V Maintimatheater guns had been set the night before. Elevation fixed, water jackets full. When the leading elements reached 200 yards, the order came down the line, "Open fire!" The plane erupted. Machine guns fired so continuously that their hoses glowed faintly in the dark. Bars clattered in the gaps, rifles cracked steady. The old guns, brought forward from Guadalcanal and Tarawa, now faced the largest single mass of attackers they would ever see. For 15 minutes, the field was pure noise. Japanese soldiers charged over their fallen comrades, bayonets flashing, officers shouting until drowned by gunfire. But the geometry of defense, those same overlapping arcs perfected 2 years earlier, broke the momentum completely. The Browning M19-117's slow, thunderous beat cut wide swaths through the ranks. By the time the charge ended, more than 2,500 Japanese lay dead. The Marine lines held. Not a single gun had failed. Saipan's massacre marked the true death of the Banzai as doctrine. Never again would the Japanese Imperial Army commit massed infantry to open assault. On later islands, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the enemy dug into volcanic rock, creating underground fortresses immune to bombardment. Yet even there, when desperation drove small counterattacks, the old guns were still waiting. At Peleliu in September 1944, temperatures hit 115 degrees Celsius. Water-cooled Brownings turned into steam engines, hoses snaking into buckets shaded under palm fronds. A single gun crew under Staff Sergeant William Fenton recorded firing over 18,000 rounds in one night against a Japanese night attack. The next morning, their water can had boiled dry, the metal jacket caked in salt. The weapon still functioned perfectly. By Okinawa in 1945, most Marines carried the newer M19-119A4, but many refused to give up their M1917s. They called them the anchors, slow and immovable, built for nights when the entire line could collapse if one gun failed. In the rare final Japan-y, east charges on Okinawa's southern ridges, the result was always the same. A few minutes of unbearable noise, then silence from Tanaru to Tarawa, from Saipan to Okinawa. One thread connected every battle: old steel, steady hands, and geometry in the dark. The Pacific had begun with faith in the charge and ended with faith in the line. The oldest guns, relics of World War I, had survived the leap into mechanized war not by chance, but by design. They had been built for the kind of endurance that no new technology could replace: simplicity, reliability, and a rhythm that matched human resolve. When the final shots faded and the Empire of Japan began to crumble, the Marines cleaned their weapons one last time, drained the black water from the jackets, and packed them for storage. Many would never fire again, but for 3 relentless years, those outdated guns had defined the sound of victory in the Pacific. A slow, relentless beat that had buried an empire's myth beneath its own dead. By the summer of 1945, the rhythm of battle had changed, but the echoes of those early nights at Guadalcanal still defined the way Marines fought. The once temporary reliance on WWI weapons had become doctrine. Commanders who had doubted the value of the Browning M19-117 now demanded it for every critical perimeter. Even as the Army replaced it with air-cooled models, the Marines requested the older water-cooled guns by serial number. Weapons with proven lineage traced back to Belleau Wood and the Meuse Argonne. After each battle, ordnance reports told the same story: guns that fired tens of thousands of rounds without mechanical failure. In one Tarawa after-action summary, Marine engineers noted that no M1917 malfunctioned due to overheating. It was as if the Pacific climate, the very thing that corroded rifles and jammed automatics, favored this anachronism. At night, steam rose from the jackets, giving the illusion of smoke. To a weary platoon, that rising mist became a symbol, the visual proof that their line still lived. When dawn came and the guns cooled, Marines poured the black water into the dirt, its surface shimmering with oil and spent brass. Every weapon became a witness. The casualty statistics told a brutal truth. In every major Banzai charge, Tanaru, Tarawa, Saipan, the Japanese suffered losses ranging from 80 to 95%. The Americans, dug in with water-cooled guns and canister-firing 37 Banbrider Seromainbin Hammers, rarely lost more than a few dozen men per sector. The pattern was mathematical. Courage alone could not cross an interlocked field of fire. Survivors of those attacks later described the psychological weight of the noise. Marines said they could feel the vibration of the M19-117s through the ground, like a heartbeat under the earth. Others remembered the sight of belt links glowing in the dark, feeding endlessly into the weapon's side. For many, that rhythm, slow, mechanical, unstoppable, came to define the sound of survival. Yet the toll on the gun crews themselves was immense. Hours behind a Browning meant deafness, burned hands, and exhaustion. Gunners often went blind from muzzle flash or collapsed from heat stroke. The Marines' victory came not from ease but endurance, from the ability to keep that weapon firing when everything else around them broke down. When reports reached Washington, ordnance officers realized the irony. The most effective infantry weapon in the Pacific was not a new design, but a relic from the last war. Plans to retire the M19-17 were quietly delayed. Factories in New England resumed small-batch production for Marine use through 1944, while Navy logistics ensured a steady supply of hoses, water cans, and spare parts. The M19-117's success also reshaped Marine tactics beyond the battlefield. Training films emphasized fire discipline, interlocking arcs, and night defense. Every recruit learned that courage meant patience, not aggression. "Hold until you can see the whites," instructors said, echoing the ghosts of their predecessors from 1918. In a war dominated by aircraft carriers and atomic research, the quiet victory of the machine gun line rarely made headlines. Yet within the Corps, it became legend, the idea that technology mattered less than the men who used it correctly. After Guadalcanal, a Marine lieutenant summarized the truth in a field report. "Our weapons may be old, but our method is new. We no longer fight the enemy. We let him break himself upon us." That simple sentence captured the spirit of an entire campaign. Precision over passion, geometry over chaos. By 1945, the lesson was clear across every branch of the U.S. military. Modern warfare didn't discard its past, it refined it. The same steel that had once held the Marne now guarded Okinawa's ridges. The war was ending, but the echo of those old Brownings lingered, shaping post-war doctrine, redefining infantry science, and proving that even in an age of machines, endurance remained a human art. In the months following Japan's surrender, as ships ferried exhausted divisions home and bases emptied across the Pacific, the Marine Corps conducted its final analyses. Thousands of weapons were collected, tagged, and examined. The reports were meticulous. Round counts, malfunctions, corrosion patterns, and the performance of every component, from the bolt face to the water hose. The verdict was unanimous. No other infantry weapon in Marine service had matched the sustained reliability of the Browning M1917. Even the M19-119A4, hailed as its successor, could not equal its endurance in long defensive engagements. The old gun's simplicity, a heavy recoil system and a sealed water jacket, had beaten time itself. At the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, engineers quietly acknowledged the irony. The most dependable weapon of America's most modern war was one first fielded in 1917. Some officers even recommended keeping the M119-117 for potential use in Korea or in defensive installations across the Pacific. Though production officially ended, the design lingered in depots and coastal batteries well into the 1950s, but the weapon's endurance was only part of its legacy. The Pacific Campaign had transformed marine doctrine. Before the war, the Corps emphasized mobility, raids, and amphibious assaults. After Guadalcanal, defense and consolidation became equally sacred skills. The final protective line, a belt of interlocked automatic fire at roughly 100 yards, became an integral part of every Marine training manual. Rehearsed range cards, overlapping arcs, and disciplined bursts were no longer optional. They were the foundation of survival. These lessons outlived the war itself. When the Korean conflict erupted in 1950, Marines on the Pusan perimeter once again relied on water-cooled Brownings from WWI storage crates. Veterans of the Pacific recognized the sound instantly. That slow, deep rhythm, each shot separated by an almost mechanical pause. History, it seemed, had looped back. For the Japanese, the cost of their doctrine was incalculable. Intelligence archives later revealed how, even after Saipan, many field officers resisted abandoning the Banzai mentality. In their eyes, dying in the charge was more honorable than surviving in defense. It took the annihilation of entire regiments before Tokyo Command officially discouraged mass frontal attacks. The shift came too late. By then, the Empire's youth had been spent on beaches where the old American guns never cooled. To historians, the paradox is striking. The Pacific War, a theater defined by aircraft carriers, radar, and amphibious innovations, was repeatedly decided by tools designed for the mud of the Western Front. In that sense, the M1917 Browning symbolized more than a weapon. It represented the continuity of military truth. Technology evolves, but the principles of firepower, discipline, and geometry remain constant. After the war, many of these guns were melted down or displayed in museums, yet a few stayed in marine armories, kept in perfect working order, just in case. Their serial plates still bore engravings from World War I contracts. Colt Patent Firearms, Hartford, Con. 1918. Beneath the rust and oil lay the DNA of 2 world wars, proof that endurance outlasts fashion. The Marines who had carried those weapons into the jungles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan rarely spoke of heroism. They spoke of weight, sweat, and sound, the heat of the barrel, the hiss of steam, the smell of boiling water and burnt powder. They remembered how those relics, older than most of them, had stood between their perimeter and oblivion, and when they handed them back to the quartermasters, the men did so quietly, not as relics of the past, but as instruments that had done their duty. The battlefield was silent now, but the lesson remained. In war, the age of a weapon matters less than the steadiness of the hands that fire it. In the quiet that followed the Pacific War, the old Browning M1917 stood like a relic that had earned its peace. Its water jacket, dented and stained, carried the memory of 2 world wars, from the trenches of the Meuse-Argonne to the jungles of Guadalcanal. For decades it had done only one thing: transform discipline into survival. When historians looked back, they saw more than a machine gun. They saw a bridge between centuries, proof that technology evolves, but the fundamentals of human endurance never change. The M1917 was slow, cumbersome, and heavy. It demanded teamwork and precision. It punished haste. In that way, it mirrored the very nature of the Marines who carried it. Every soldier who worked its crank handle learned a truth older than the weapon itself: that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act with precision when fear is absolute. The Browning's rhythm, steady and deliberate, became the sound of that philosophy. The Japanese Banzai charges had been built on faith in momentum, in the unstoppable spirit of the attack. The Marines' answer was faith in order. Range cards, sandbags, interlocking arcs, where one side shouted into the night, the other listened, measured, and fired when the geometry aligned. It was an old equation, written first in the mud of France and recalculated under Pacific starlight. By 1945, the world had entered the atomic age. But on the front lines, victory still came from the hands of men kneeling behind tripods, sweating in silence, trusting a weapon designed before their fathers went to war. The M1917 was retired quietly, but its doctrine endured. The conviction that no matter how modern the battlefield becomes, wars are still won by calm fire under pressure. And so, when the last veterans spoke of those nights, of the steam rising from the guns, of the silence after the roar, they did not remember the weapon as old. They remembered it as faithful. A relic, yes, but also, in its own way, the heartbeat of the line that never broke.